Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 714 for July 15th, 2018. Coming up in a few minutes.
I bought so much stuff off of eBay, many times duplicates, triplicates, that my wife has joked that there is a cottage industry of people making fake pepper memorabilia and selling it to me on eBay.
Last December, Amir Peay reopened the James E. Pepper Distillery in downtown Lexington, Kentucky, almost 50 years after the original distillery closed. This week, the distillery opened its doors to tourists for the first time with a display of pepper memorabilia painstakingly collected by Amir Peay over the last decade. We'll talk with him on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's coming up later, along with the calendar of events, your voice, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and Behind the Label, all on this edition of WhiskyCast.
This is whiskey, Johnnie Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnnie Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's start with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. We reported last month that Sazerac had received planning approval for a new distillery along Interstate 24 in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and now we're getting more details on the company's plans. Back in 2016, Sazerac bought the old Popcorn Sutton Distillery in Newport, Tennessee, just east of Knoxville, and switched it from distilling moonshine to Tennessee whiskey. Master distiller John Lunn and distiller Alyssa Henley started making that whiskey a year ago this month. While they'll keep running the stills in Newport until the new facility is completed in 2020, the plans are to move the entire operation, lock, stills, and barrels, so to speak, to Murfreesboro at that time and close the Newport facility. The new distillery will open with two 20,000-barrel warehouses, along with a visitor's center. There's no timetable for bottling the first whiskey from the Newport distillery, since the oldest barrels are just a year old right now. Meanwhile, Denmark's Stauning Whisky is about to open its new distillery. The project has been in the works since Diageo's Distilled Ventures unit bought a stake in Stauning in 2015. The new distillery will have its own floor maltings, along with 24 small pot stills. It'll open to the public August 25th as part of the Stauning Whisky Festival. Texas's Ben Milam Distillery has taken a big step forward. The craft distiller in Blanco, Texas, has brought on board veteran Jim Beam distiller Marlene Holmes as head distiller for its bourbon and rye whiskeys. She recently retired after 27 years at Jim Beam, and distillery founder Marcia Milam persuaded her to make the move to Blanco, which is in the Texas Hill Country between Austin and San Antonio. And finally, congratulations to the Glenlivet's Alan Winchester. He was honored with this year's International Spirits Challenge Lifetime Achievement Award Thursday night in London. It only took him 40 years to win it. I'm kidding, of course. Glenmorangie's Bill Lumsden was named Master Blender and Distiller of the Year, while William Grant & Sons was named Distiller of the Year and Scotch Whisky Producer of the Year. Suntory Spirits was named World Whisky Producer of the Year. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park. Want to try a single cask Highland Park? Okay, this one you're going to have to go to Munich to find, thanks to the folks at Drampedia.com for finding and tweeting about a 12-year-old Highland Park single cask bottled exclusively for the shop at Munich Airport. It's just one of the many surprises you'll find from Highland Park. The Orkney single malt with Viking soul. Keep your eyes open. You never know what you'll find next from Highland Park. Visit them on the web at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. Tales of the Cocktail gets underway on Tuesday and runs through this coming weekend in New Orleans. We'll have special coverage from Tales this week on WhiskyCast. If you're in or near New York City, the McAllen will have its immersive distillery and visitor experience with a virtual tour of their new distillery at Grand Central Station's Vanderbilt Hall, July 25th through the 27th. Whiskey Live Perth is on the 27th and 28th in Perth, Australia, along with Whiskey Brothers' The Only Whiskey Show in Johannesburg, South Africa. The Houston Whiskey Social is July 28th in Houston, Texas. The Scotch Whisky Experience in Edinburgh, Scotland has a Benromic tasting August 9th and a Glenrothes tasting on the 10th. And Royal Mile Whiskies in Edinburgh has its annual Whiskey Fringe Festival, August 10th through the 12th. McTeers has its next whiskey auction in Glasgow, Scotland, August 17th, and Bonhams has an auction the same day. It's in Hong Kong. And finally, the Spirit of Alba Gin and Whiskey Festival is August 25th in Kirkintilloch, Scotland. Right now, we have 194 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have a festival, tasting, or other whiskey-related event coming up, just use the contact form on our website to let us know all about it.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that will be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. The Pepper family started making whiskey in Kentucky all the way back in 1780, when Kentucky was still officially part of Virginia. Elijah Pepper set up his still in the town of Versailles, and later moved to Glens Creek on the site of what we know today as Woodford Reserve Distillery. His grandson James had to sell that distillery after the Civil War because of financial issues, but he returned to the whiskey business in 1879 when he built the country's largest distillery in downtown Lexington and put his own name on it. Pepper died in 1906. The distillery survived through Prohibition and a fire, but Shenley eventually closed it down in 1958. The distillery site sat idle for decades, but it's now become the heart of Lexington's Distillery District, with bars, a brewery, and galleries. Amir Peay acquired the rights to the James E. Pepper brand 10 years ago, and while he's been bottling sourced whiskey under that brand name, he always wanted to reopen the distillery itself. That happened last December, using a large part of the original distillery building, but with all new equipment. You got the distillery going in December. How are things going with it?
Well, things are going fantastic. We have been in full production since December, and we are very pleased with the process and with the distillate coming off the stills.
And now you're opening it up to visitors.
That's correct. This Thursday, we will open the doors to our visitor center and welcome people into the distillery, where they will come and take a tour of the museum on site and go through the whole full working distillery.
How many visitors do you expect to have per year?
Well, I guess we'll find out, but looking around at comparable distilleries, I think Alltech, which is right down the street, gets about 50,000 visitors a year, and Woodford, which is about 20, 30 minutes away, is 100, 120,000 plus a year. So I don't think we'll be near the Woodford numbers, and I think that our distillery can't handle that kind of capacity. Plus, we'd really like to give a very intimate and educational tour, so something a little bit more unique, something that's not really rushed. And so I think we'll find a sweet spot and kind of cap it at a certain number.
And you have the ability to show off a little bit of the history behind the James E. Pepper Distillery, too, don't you?
Well, absolutely. This has been a 10-year project that I've worked on, and a big part of that has been acquiring and building a collection of every kind of artifact, memorabilia, old documentation, historical ads, articles, that kind of stuff for the brand, and assembling all those things, using it to retell the story and piece together forgotten parts of the story, as well as build a small museum collection. And we have all of that on display in the distillery. I actually have such a large collection, I couldn't display it all. So we really had to narrow it down to what I think are the coolest items, and also the ones that tell a very succinct story about the brand history and showcase different eras of the brand through these old bottles and memorabilia. And so we have, of course, a big collection of old documentation, letters from James E. Pepper from the 1890s. We have the exact recipes, production methods, grain bills from the old distilleries that were used at this distillery when it shut down in 1958, and should go back all the way to the American Revolution. We also have, detailed mechanical engineering drawings of the actual still system that was built at that distillery in 1934, the year Prohibition was repealed in Kentucky, and that still was built by Vendome Copper and Brass in Louisville, who, of course, we worked with to rebuild the still there today. And, of course, we have a big collection of vintage, perfectly preserved pepper whiskey from before, during, and after Prohibition.
So how did you define the cool stuff, as you put it?
Well, for me, it's anything, that's pretty geeky. I like the stuff that is really technical a little bit. So things like the detailed mechanical engineering drawings, 17 pages of those, that to me are very cool when designing a system, designing a layout of equipment. Things that also relate to the history of the pepper brand as it relates to the advancement of bourbon in Kentucky. That distillery, our distillery, was the first distillery in Kentucky to bottle its own whiskey. It was illegal in the early 1890s, and James E. Pepper got the law changed in Kentucky to allow him to bottle his whiskey at the distillery, and he was very proud of that fact. And so he would promote it and also invented kind of some cool things about the packaging. One of those being the strip stamp that goes over the stopper of so many bottles you see today. James E. Pepper had a problem with people refilling bottles, and trademark law was very weak. So Pepper came up with an ingenious idea because forgery law was very strong. So he created this little strip of paper that they would print his signature over, and he would put it over the stopper of the bottle, and they would advertise that consumers should not buy it unless it bore his signature unbroken across the top. And if somebody replicated that signature, they wouldn't come after you for trademark infringement, they would come after you for forgery infringement. And so things like this that we have, old promotional boards, wooden boards, beautiful hand-painted boards from the 1890s that point out each one of these little things. And of course, the fact that that strip stamp was such a popular idea, it was later incorporated by the federal government into the Bottled and Bond Act. Very cool stuff like that. That's the stuff that I like to highlight and kind of show off.
I got to ask a question about this, and I'm not trying to doubt you here, but I thought Old Forester was the first one to bottle whiskeys.
Well, you're correct about that. However, Old Forester was a rectifier. They weren't a distiller.
Okay.
And you can look, there was a great article, Michael Veatch, a very respected bourbon historian, wrote an article about this very thing, about James E. Pepper lobbying to get the laws changed in Kentucky.
Okay. Because Old Forester makes a big deal about being the first one to sell bottled whiskey, and it was about 20 years or so before Pepper did, so that's one I hadn't heard before.
Yeah, well, again, you can check out Michael Veatch's article, and to my recollection, Old Forester and that label was bottled initially by a rectifier, so they were not distillers at that time, and that's my understanding of the history.
Okay. So I have to ask, and this is going to sound a little cheeky, but when you were doing all your research and contacting people and anything to try to find all these artifacts, did anybody ever confuse James E. Pepper with Dr. Pepper?
No, thankfully not. Most people don't really confuse soda and whiskey brands. So,
I'm sorry,
no.
I had to ask. Only because I know there's a whole bunch of
but
Dr. Pepper collectors out there, and I figure, okay, if you're searching for pepper memorabilia, all this Dr. Pepper crap is going to come up. So,
no, but I can just tell you that as probably the premier historian and collector of anything pepper whiskey related, I bought so much stuff off of eBay, many times duplicates, triplicates, that my wife has joked that there is a cottage industry of people making fake pepper memorabilia and selling it to me on eBay. So, I've seen a lot of interesting things, but nothing that confuses Dr. Pepper with James E. Pepper.
Now, wait a second. Did you ever get faked out on any of this stuff? Did they actually sell you something that was a fake?
No, not to my knowledge. I have not bought anything that has been fake. Of course, you never know. Something slipped by me. And as I, laughingly point out to my wife, some of these things, like the historic bottles from the 1890s that have these beautiful embossing, on them, I tell my wife that the cost for somebody to replicate a bottle mold and to do all of that would have been, many times what I paid for the bottle. So it wouldn't have made a lot of economic sense. And I got a pretty good eye for things. So no, to my knowledge, no fakes, all originals. So
when will we see your whiskey mixed in with the stuff that you're sourcing? Because I know that was your plan originally, right? You weren't ever going to replace all of the sourced whiskey you're using for pepper with the stuff you're making in Lexington now, right?
Well, that's correct. We had certain inherent limitations in terms of the size and the scale of the distillery we could build. A lot of that was due to logistical issues. A distillery is a factory, and a factory is a nonstop parade of semis, 18-wheelers. It's a lot. And for us to be in a city, in an urban area, without really great logistics for that, we were kind of inherently limited. Now, the distillery is a full working bourbon distillery. It is not a dog and pony show. It is basically a smaller version of exactly what the big guys build. We have the best distillery team in the state of Kentucky design and build it. This is from the engineers, the architects, the still manufacturers. But we right now do about 50% of our production at that distillery in Lexington, and we outsource about 50%. And we could double or triple our capacity in Lexington. But I think for right now, we're in a comfortable space. And yes, we will be blending in some of what we distill in Lexington into the existing product lines, the 1776. And of course, in a few years, we will have entirely new product lines of whiskeys distilled 100% in Lexington.
I ask this question a lot, but what did you think when you saw your first spirit coming off the still last December?
A lot of excitement. Again, for me, this has been a decade-long journey of reviving kind of this lost and forgotten iconic whiskey brand, as well as rebuilding this historic distillery that was abandoned for over 50 years. And for me, being a guy who, grew up doing every horrible job in the restaurant business, as a busboy, a waiter, bar back, a bartender, and really just kind of took an entrepreneur's journey, a bootstrapping entrepreneur's journey, and to go from all of that and then through the journey of relaunching it to, putting in those beautiful copper stills from Vendome, and then finally watching the distillate flow off the stills using the exact same historic recipe that was last run in there in 1958. Just a very satisfying moment. And so I think the only thing that might top it is when we bottle that whiskey in a few years down the road.
There's a link for the James E. Pepper Distillery in our show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. And thanks to Amir Peay for joining us on WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay Single Malt. Look for the classic Lagavulin 16-year-old, the Distiller's Edition, and the throwback 8-year-old Lagavulin at a whiskey shop near you. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Let's start off with Kavalan's Brandy Oak Single Malt from Taiwan. It's bottled at 54% ABV, and it is not a cask finish. It's matured entirely in ex-brandy casks. The nose is fruity and sweet with notes of orange marmalade, honey, soft spices, and just a hint of dark chocolate. The taste is vibrant and fruity with orange marmalade, a touch of white pepper, hints of honey and dark chocolate, and just a touch of pencil shavings. The finish is long with lingering spices and a touch of orange marmalade. And I'm scoring the Cavalan Brandy Oak a 92. Vicomte is a French distillery that uses cognac casks to mature its single malts, including the 9-year-old cask strength version that's bottled at a whopping 67.8% ABV. The nose has notes of cherries, figs, plums, and soft spices. The taste has good spicy notes of allspice and a hint of clove, along with toasted oak, cherry cobbler, and touches of anise, vanilla, and chocolate. The finish is long with fading spices and a nice touch of chocolate-covered cherries. I'm scoring the Vicomte Cask Strength Edition a 90. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, proud to announce the 2018 edition of Parker's Heritage Collection. This year's edition carries on Parker Beam's legacy of excellence and innovation with a unique bourbon finished in orange Curacao barrels that accent the bourbon's own natural hints of citrus. Once again, sales of this year's edition of the Parker's Heritage Collection will benefit the ALS Association. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Old Forester's 1920 bourbon is bottled at 57.5% ABV, and the nose has notes of caramel, butterscotch, honey, muted spices, and hints of charred oak and pipe tobacco. The taste has good spicy notes of black pepper and a hint of cinnamon, along with vanilla, honey, and pipe tobacco. The finish is long and spicy with just a hint of honey. I'm scoring the Old Forester 1920 bourbon a 92. And finally, let's look at Stalk & Barrel's Red Blend Canadian whiskey. This one is a blend of the single malt and rye whiskeys from Stillwater's Distillery in the Toronto suburbs. It's bottled at 43% ABV. The nose is malty with a nice balance of muted rye spices, honey, vanilla, and hints of dried fruits and linseed oil. The taste has good spices balanced by a citrusy tartness and hints of barley sugar, along with touches of honey and vanilla in the background. The finish has long, lingering spices and nice touches of dried fruits. I'm scoring the Stalk & Barrel Red Blend a 92. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,200 different whiskeys from around the world at WhiskyCast.com.
This is whiskey. Johnny Walker's Scotch whiskey. From this place, and these places in that place. These are the people that make it. This is what they sound like.
Because you're a cheeky wee blighter.
Dance like. Aye, like that. This is what they do all day. Building the great character of Johnny Walker Black Label. Aging in oak for 12 long years.
Thanks. Oh, it's gorgeous there.
What is character? It's giving a damn.
You're all right, lassie.
Which looks like this, as much as this. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whiskey all shape how bloody good it tastes.
Put the bloody game on the telly, Ella.
A whiskey as bold as it is complex. For every step you take, this is Johnny Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up.
Cut.
Can I drink this now?
Johnny Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice, brought to you by Lot 40. Mark Williams, at Live Paint on Instagram, posted this note along with one of his photos from inside the James E. Pepper Distillery. It was an experience to tour a distillery on the first day that tours were offered. I got to try some spirit straight from the still. Thanks to WhiskyCast for the information. as I was listening to the podcast as I was driving to Lexington. I mentioned last month that Nika from the Barrel is coming to the U.S. market for the first time. Until now, it's only been bottled in 500 ml bottles that aren't legal for sale in the U.S., but Nika is now producing 750 ml bottles just for the U.S. I poured a dram of it the other night from a bottle I had here at home and posted a photo on social media with the comment that I won't have to ration it anymore now that it'll be available in the U.S. Gus Gonzalez III responded from Austin, Texas. Indeed, I still have most of the bottle I bought in Paris in 2014. As soon as I find it here in Austin, I'm going to crack that old bottle open. And Dan Kazul at Kodan of Canada tweeted this: I'm far from a connoisseur of Japanese whiskey, but of the ones I've tried, that one trumps them all. At Headstone tweeted this note from London over the weekend: I'm guessing you haven't tasted this, but I'm enjoying it, along with a photo of the new Scallywag Chocolate Edition from Douglas Lang & Company that we mentioned in the news earlier this month. And Headstone's right. I have not tasted that one since it isn't coming to the U.S., so I asked him how it was, and have to admit I like the way he phrased it. It's a bit like a chocolate brownie with cream. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com. You can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Drink responsibly. Let's close the show out now with Behind the Label, our look at the science, history, and other things that make whiskey unique. I mentioned Nika from the Barrel and the bottle size issue a minute ago. We've covered bottle sizes many times in the past, but usually in terms of the full-size bottles, 750 mLs in the U.S. and 700 milliliters in the European Union. Most other countries will accept either one. South Africa is the only other country besides the U.S. that requires 750 ml bottles. But the U.S. only allows distilled spirits to be bottled in 7 different sizes: 50 milliliter airplane size bottles, along with 100 ml, 200 ml, and 375 mLs. That's half the size of the standard 750 ml bottle, along with larger 1-liter and 1.75-liter bottles. Ironically, those 500 ml bottles that Nika from the Barrel comes in were legal when the U.S. switched to metric sizes back in 1980, but they were banned starting in 1989. The European Union, though, changed its standard size to 700 ml in 1990. And while the EU also allows 50, 100, and 200 ml sizes, same as the US, it has 350 and 500 ml sizes too. The EU also allows 1.5 and 2-liter bottles, along with the so-called Jeroboam size 3-liter bottles. Over here we'd call those party size. Don't look for either side to give way soon, though, on adopting a common global bottle size. While it would seem to make a lot of sense, that would force one side to give up a bargaining chip in trade negotiations, and we have all seen how that's working these days. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. That's also where you'll find links for WhiskyCast HD videos and our WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, brought to you by the Whiskey Exchange, along with the latest whiskey news, events, photos, and a whole lot more, including a complete archive of all of our past episodes. Our cask strength conversation continues all week long online. You'll find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
This is whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch whisky, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you twice each week from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.